The next financial shock has already started, but most people won't feel it until it's too late. And by the time it becomes obvious, your bills will already be higher, your savings will stretch less, and your income may not feel as secure as it once did. Right now, the headlines suggest things are calming down, that tensions are easing and markets are stabilizing. But financially, the real damage is only just beginning. Because this isn't about politics or headlines, it's about how money flows through the global system. And once that flow is disrupted, the consequences take time to show up in everyday life. What triggered this shift was a disruption to a critical global oil route, and the easiest way to understand it is to imagine a narrow highway that carries nearly 20% of the world's oil supply suddenly being blocked, with no simple alternative and no immediate solution. And even if that blockage is partially cleared, uncertainty alone is enough to keep the system under pressure. Oil is not just about petrol prices. It is the foundation of modern economies, embedded in food production, transportation, manufacturing, packaging, and energy. So when oil prices rise sharply, the cost of almost everything begins to rise with it, step by step, from raw materials all the way to the final price you pay. And those increases rarely reverse quickly because businesses adjust slowly and protect their margins. This is where most people misunderstand what is happening, because they assume that when the situation appears to stabilize, prices will fall just as quickly. But that is not how economic shocks work. It is much closer to a delayed reaction, like food poisoning, where the cause may be in the past, but the effects are still working their way through the system, and by the time you feel it fully, the process is already well underway. As prices rise, a second effect begins to take hold, and this is where the real pressure builds, because when everyday costs increase, people naturally spend less on non-essential items, and when consumers pull back, businesses start to feel that pressure almost immediately. Revenue slows down while operating costs remain high or even increase, and that creates a squeeze that forces companies to make difficult decisions. At first, those decisions are subtle, reducing overtime, delaying expansion plans, freezing hiring. But if the pressure continues, those small adjustments turn into more significant actions, such as layoffs and restructuring. And this is how a cost shock in one part of the economy begins to spread into the job market. What once felt like a stable income can quickly become uncertain, not because of individual performance, but because of broader economic conditions that are outside of anyone's direct control. This is the stage where many people are caught off guard, because the shift does not happen all at once. It builds gradually and then accelerates. And by the time it becomes visible in job losses and reduced opportunities, it is already difficult to react quickly. In previous economic crises, governments and central banks had relatively clear tools to stabilize the situation. They could lower interest rates to encourage borrowing and spending, or inject money into the system to support businesses and households. And while those actions were not perfect, they were often effective enough to prevent prolonged downturns. However, the current environment is far more complicated, because the very tools used to fix one problem can worsen another. For example, lowering interest rates can stimulate growth but also fuel inflation, while printing money can provide short-term relief but weaken the currency and reduce purchasing power over time, and maintaining high rates to control inflation can slow the economy further and increase the risk of job losses. This creates a situation where there is no simple or immediate solution, and policymakers are forced to balance competing risks, which often leads to slower and less decisive action. This combination of rising prices and slowing economic activity has a name, and it is one of the most challenging conditions for individuals and businesses alike because it places pressure on both sides of the financial equation. Income becomes less stable while expenses continue to rise, and the usual strategies that work in normal economic cycles become less effective. In this type of environment, simply waiting for things to return to normal can be a costly mistake because the timeline for recovery is uncertain and the path is rarely smooth. Instead, the individuals who navigate these periods most effectively are the ones who focus on control, not prediction. Because while it is impossible to control global events, it is possible to control how you respond to them. There are a few key principles that consistently separate those who struggle during economic shifts from those who adapt and even improve their position. The first is protecting cash flow, which means being cautious about taking on new financial commitments that assume stable or improving conditions. Because in uncertain environments, flexibility becomes more valuable than expansion, and having a financial buffer can provide the time needed to adjust if circumstances change. The second is increasing personal value, which involves developing skills and capabilities that make you more useful, more adaptable, and harder to replace. Because in competitive or constrained job markets, those who provide the most value tend to have greater security and more opportunities. The third is building additional sources of income, even if they start small, because diversification reduces dependence on a single source and creates optionality, which is one of the most powerful forms of leverage in uncertain times. At the same time, there are broader shifts happening at the institutional level that are worth paying attention to, because large organizations and investors often move early, not in reaction to headlines, but in anticipation of long-term trends. And one of the patterns that tends to emerge during periods of uncertainty is a gradual shift away from higher-risk assets toward assets that are perceived to hold value more consistently. This does not happen overnight, and it is not always obvious in the short term, but over time it can influence markets, currencies, and investment flows in ways that eventually affect everyday financial decisions. Understanding that these shifts are happening can provide useful context, not for making impulsive decisions, but for thinking more carefully about concentration risk and long-term positioning. Another important aspect to consider is that economic shocks do not affect everyone equally, because the impact depends heavily on how income is earned and how expenses are structured. For some individuals, rising costs may be inconvenient but manageable, while for others, the same increases can significantly alter daily life and financial stability. This difference highlights the importance of resilience, not just in terms of income, but also in terms of financial structure, because having lower fixed costs, more flexibility, and multiple options can make a substantial difference in how external pressures are experienced. It also reinforces the idea that preparation is not about reacting to fear, but about reducing vulnerability. Throughout history, every major economic shift has created both challenges and opportunities. And while it is natural to focus on the risks, it is equally important to recognize that periods of change often reward those who are able to adapt quickly and think strategically. The key is not to assume that the future will mirror the past, but to recognize patterns, understand incentives, and position yourself in a way that increases your ability to respond effectively as new information emerges. This mindset shifts the focus away from trying to predict exact outcomes and toward building systems and habits that perform well across a range of scenarios. In the end, there are always two broad groups during times like this: those who wait for clarity and reassurance before taking action, and those who accept uncertainty and begin adjusting early. And while waiting may feel safer in the moment, it often results in fewer options and more pressure later on. Whereas early adaptation, even if imperfect, tends to create more flexibility and better positioning over time. The warning signs are already present, not in a single headline or event, but in the underlying shifts that are gradually working their way through the system. And the question is not whether change is coming, but how prepared you will be when its effects become impossible to ignore. Because by the time it feels obvious to everyone, the window to act comfortably is usually already closing.